Well, I'm really lucky today. I'm in the swim now and I've been able to bring my truck right up close to it, so this is fantastic. No lugging all that heavy gear around. And now that I'm in position, I'm going to use a piece of kit that's become more and more important in modern carp fishing, and that's a marker float rod. Now, you don't have to use one of these setups every time you go carp fishing. Once you get really familiar with your lake, you'll be able to cast almost in the dark to some of the classic spots. And if you're fishing a really small water, then a marker float probably isn't really essential. But on large open waters particularly, you'll find one of these invaluable. What does a marker float setup do? Well, primarily it does three things. First of all, it can help you gauge the depth, so you'll be able to find depth variations in the lake by casting it out and using the marker float as a depth gauge. Secondly, it can act as a target for your bait and for your rig, so that's very important too. And then thirdly, if you set it up right, it can also tell you a great deal about the bottom out there, whether you're fishing over sand or gravel or silt or weed. This is a very basic marker float setup. The float is brightly coloured. You'll find that orange is very good for dark coloured water. Black is very good on shiny water, but essentially you want a nice buoyant float that you're going to be able to see at range. This is a special lead here. It runs on the line with a very large diameter ring. That's quite important. You'll find that out when you try to pop the marker float up to the surface if you cast it into weed or silt. The larger the diameter of this ring here, the better the line tends to flow through it. And the lead, well, it's a peculiar shape, isn't it, really? It looks like something out of a Doctor Who movie. So why is the lead designed like this? Well, these nodules, when they're dragged across a hard bottom, actually transmit vibrations up the line much better than a regular shaped lead. So there's method in the madness there. The main line, as you can see, is braided main line. This is Total Fishing Gear grunt braid in 30-pound breaking strain, which might seem a bit high. This is a very robust braid. And actually £30 is the diameter of 8-pound line. So although it's very strong and will stand up to the rigours of marker float fishing, you can cast it a very long way. Now the reason that you use braid is primarily because when you drag this lead back across the bottom, braid has virtually zero stretch. So any vibrations that are sent back up the line, any information about the nature of the bottom, will be amplified by braid. Mono cushions those signals because it's got so much elasticity and you won't feel so much what is going on out there. The way I always liken it is that fishing without braid in this situation is a bit like getting into the bath with your socks on. It doesn't feel quite right, but braid does. Now, the type of rod that you use for this kind of work is really important too. My own company, Total Fishing Gear, is one of the companies that makes dedicated marker float rods. Why are they important? Well, because you're using that marker float to try and establish features below the water, places that are going to hold carp that you can't see. And being able, firstly, to reach large distances. Sometimes you might be fishing 100 yards out, and there's no point in trying to cast that far with a marker float rod that's not up to the job. So distance is important. The rod needs to be able to cast, but it also needs to have the right action to transmit information back up the line, and this rod's got all of that. We call it the G-spot, and the reason that we call it the G-spot is because marker floats are used to find those little sweet spots in the swim where you're going to catch a lot of carp, the ones that are going to bring you a lot of pleasure. So G-spot is a very appropriate name. But on the serious side, this is a proper marker float rod. It's 12 feet long. It's got a very, very fast action. The tip is very flexible, so that when I drag this lead across the bottom, it will tell me an awful lot about the nature of the bottom. It works perfectly with a braided line. The other thing is that the bottom section of the rod down here is quite stiff. This is a very fast action rod. It's not designed for fishing, it's designed for casting marker floats a long way. And then a final touch, and all good marker float rods have this, is a depth marker 1 foot up from the reel seat. I'll show you how that works in a moment, because we're actually going to use this marker float setup to have a look at what depth we've got out there in front of us.